The 11th of November, 1940, a little before 11 o'clock at night. The harbour at Taranto, on the heel of Italy, lies quiet under a thin moon. Vittorio Padovani has commanded an anti-aircraft battery on the breakwater for 2 years. He is not a rookie. He is one of the best gunnery officers in the fleet, and he knows this stretch of water the way a man knows the road to his own front door. He knows the sound of every engine that has ever crossed this sky. He knows the range tables by heart. He knows to the metre how deep the water is where the great battleships lie at anchor. 40 feet. He has checked it himself, and so, when the first low droning reaches him out of the dark, slow and heavy and wrong, he does the only thing a competent officer can do. He tries to explain it away. It cannot be torpedo aircraft. Everyone knows an aerial torpedo needs deep water to run, and this water is too shallow. It cannot be a serious attack because the fleet would have put to sea first. It cannot be many aeroplanes because no carrier would dare come this close. He is right about all of it. Every calculation is correct, and in a few minutes, none of it will matter. Pause on that sentence. A man can be entirely right and entirely finished at the same moment. This is not a story about obsolete biplanes. This is a story about a quiet, reasonable piece of arithmetic that an entire navy had agreed upon, and the single night that proved the arithmetic wrong. Part 1. To understand what Padovani was hearing, we have to go back, not to the summer of 1940, but to a much older and far more comfortable idea about how a navy dies. For 400 years, a battle fleet in its own defended harbour was considered safe. Not perfectly safe. Safe enough. A harbour meant shore batteries, booms and nets. Above all, it meant distance from the enemy's guns. The danger came from other ships, and other ships could be met at sea and fought there. This was not a superstition. It was the accumulated experience of every naval officer alive. By 1940, the Italian Royal Navy, the Regia Marina, was one of the strongest in the world. 6 battleships. 2 of them, the Littorio and her sister, were almost new, among the most powerful warships afloat, with 15-inch guns and a speed of 30 knots. 7 heavy cruisers, a wall of destroyers. Winston Churchill himself admitted in his own account of the war that on paper the Italian fleet was considerably more powerful than the British Mediterranean fleet it faced, and the Italians had a doctrine to match those ships. It was in effect a fleet in being. Italy could not easily replace anything larger than a destroyer, so the capital ships were precious beyond price. The plan was not to seek a great battle and win it. The plan was simply to exist. To sit at Taranto as a standing threat, a fist held ready, forcing the British to guard every convoy to Malta and North Africa against the chance that the fleet might sail. Read that line again, because it matters. Their strategy was not cowardice, it was arithmetic. A fleet that survives is a fleet that threatens. A fleet spent in one glorious afternoon threatens nothing ever again. And they had done the arithmetic on air attack too. This is the part that most people get wrong today. The Italian admirals were not fools who had forgotten that aeroplanes existed. They had weighed the aeroplane carefully and set it aside, for reasons that were, at the time, entirely sound. An aerial torpedo, when it is dropped, plunges deep before it levels out to run. Every navy on Earth believed such a weapon needed deep water beneath it, 60 feet, 75 feet, or it would simply bury its nose in the mud of the harbour floor and do nothing. The water at Taranto was around 40 feet. By the doctrine of every navy alive, the British one included, a torpedo attack in that harbour was close to impossible. The water was too shallow. Hold on to that sentence. And even if it could be done, there was a second wall behind the first. A senior officer of the Italian naval staff, Marcantonio Bragadin, set the assumption down plainly after the war in his history of the Italian Navy. It was taken for granted, he wrote, that if British forces ever came within striking range of Taranto, the Italian fleet would put to sea and engage them before any air attack could be launched. The fleet would not sit and be hit. It would sail out and fight. That was the entire point of it. If you had stood on that breakwater beside Padovani, you would have reasoned exactly as he did. So the harbour was ringed with defences that fit the threat they expected. More than 100 anti-aircraft guns, 22 searchlights, listening devices that could hear an aircraft engine 25 miles out, barrage balloons on cables to force any attacker high, steel torpedo nets slung in the water around the moorings. His assessment was not insane. It was built on the best data available anywhere in the world. The problem was not that the Italians reasoned badly. The problem was that the ground beneath the reasoning had quietly shifted, and no one had told them. Their model worked. It worked for 400 years. It worked right up until the night it didn't. Part 2. Here is the weapon that broke 400 years of arithmetic. It was not fast. It was not modern. It was by any fair measure a museum piece. The Fairey Swordfish was a biplane. 2 wings, an open cockpit, fixed landing gear, 1 propeller, and a body of metal frame stretched over fabric. Wire and canvas and string. The men who flew it did not resent the nickname the fleet had given it. They called it the string bag, and they said it with affection. It cruised at about 90 miles an hour. A modern fighter could fly circles around it, and often did. And yet, string and canvas would do that night what steel and speed could not. Because the aircrews of the Fleet Air Arm had solved the shallow water problem that the Italians believed unsolvable. They fitted their 18-inch torpedoes with a magnetic pistol, a device meant to fire the warhead as it passed beneath a ship's keel, and they rigged each torpedo so that a length of wire held its nose up as it entered the sea, so that instead of diving for the bottom, it belly-flopped and ran flat and shallow. Trials off Malta had shown that a torpedo could be coaxed to run in water barely deeper than a swimming pool. The water was too shallow, except that it wasn't. Not anymore. Someone had done new arithmetic and had told almost no one. On the evening of the 11th, 21 swordfish flew off the deck of His Majesty's ship Illustrious, from a point in the Ionian Sea about 170 miles from the target. Before they left, Admiral Andrew Cunningham, who commanded the Mediterranean fleet, signalled to Rear Admiral Lumley Lister, the officer who had planned the strike. He wished good luck to the lads in their enterprise, and told him their success might have a most important bearing on the whole course of the war in the Mediterranean. Then the aircraft went, in 2 waves, in the dark, alone. Leading the first wave was Lieutenant Commander Kenneth Williamson, commanding officer of 815 Squadron, a regular naval airman who had spent his career in exactly these unglamorous machines. In the observer's seat behind him sat Lieutenant Norman Scarlett. The crews had a taste for grim humour. Williamson was known as Hooch. Scarlett was known, with straight faces all round, as Blood. These were not daredevils. They were not gamblers. They were professionals doing a rehearsed and terrible job. Just before 11 o'clock, Williamson led his section down through the searchlights and the anti-aircraft fire, so low that men afterwards swore the aircraft were below the height of the ship's masts. They flew low, they flew slow, they flew straight in. And Williamson released his torpedo at the battleship Conte di Cavour. The torpedo ran true. It ran in water that was supposed to be too shallow to allow it, and it struck the Cavour below the waterline, and it opened her hull to the sea. Then the fire that filled the sky found Williamson's aeroplane, and his swordfish went down into the harbour. He and Scarlett were pulled from the water by Italian sailors and spent the rest of the war as prisoners. For that single run, Williamson received the Distinguished Service Order. Scarlett received the Distinguished Service Cross. 2 men in a fabric biplane had just put a modern battleship on the bottom of her own anchorage. The gunners firing at them could not make sense of what they were seeing. Their weapons were built to engage aircraft attacking from height. These attackers came in under the guns from below the muzzles at the altitude of a low bird. An Italian account afterwards admitted that the volume of fire had been tremendous, and its effect almost nothing, because no one had ever built a harbour to fight an enemy who arrived at 50 feet. Men like the crews of 815 and 819 Squadron, who flew string and canvas into the guns of an entire battle fleet and did not turn back, deserve to be remembered. Every like on this video keeps the story of that harbour and those crews in front of a few more people. It costs you nothing. It matters more than it should. Part 3. Here is the number I want you to carry out of this video because the whole story hangs from it. 21 aircraft. 21 obsolete biplanes flew off one carrier on one night. 2 of them did not come back. And in the space of about an hour, those aircraft put 3 of Italy's 6 battleships out of the war. Half of the Italian battle fleet, crippled at its own moorings by 21 aeroplanes made of wire and fabric for the loss of 2. Let that be contextualized, and it becomes almost impossible to believe. The Littorio, one of the newest battleships in the world, took 3 torpedoes and was out of action for months. The Caio Duilio was torpedoed and had to be run aground to stop her from sinking. The Conte di Cavour, the ship Williamson struck, settled onto the harbour bottom and in plain truth never fought again. 3 capital ships, one night, 21 aircraft. How does a slow, obsolete aeroplane achieve what no modern air force on Earth had ever managed? Not by accident, and not by luck alone. The Royal Navy was, at that moment, the only navy in the world that had seriously trained its aircrews to fly torpedo strikes at night, from a carrier against a defended fleet. Other navies owned the aircraft. Only the British had spent the dull grey years of peace practicing the one skill that turned out to decide everything. And there is something in the British way of war here that is worth naming, without flattering it too much. It is the amateur tradition, a tolerance for the eccentric idea, the odd invention, the officer who tinkers in a workshop when he ought to be at dinner. The very obsolescence of the Swordfish was, perversely, its strength. It was slow enough to fly low and land on a heaving deck in the dark. It was simple enough that a torpedo could be modified with a length of wire by men working with their hands in a hangar in the middle of the sea. And here is why the Italians, for all their fine ships, could not simply do the same thing back the following week. They had no aircraft carrier at all. Their naval air power belonged to a separate air force that had not trained for this, and did not answer to the fleet. They had no radar, they had no night fighters. Their entire system had been built around the great daylight gun battle that the doctrine promised and that never came. You cannot improvise in a single night, a capability that takes a decade of quiet practice to build. 21 aircraft did what they did precisely because a whole system stood behind those 21 aircraft, and no equivalent system stood behind the guns of Taranto. If your father, your grandfather, or your uncle served in the Fleet Air Arm or in the Mediterranean Fleet in those years, I would be grateful if you would leave their name and their unit in the comments below. These stories survive in the archives, but they also survive in families, and that is very often how the memory is truly kept. Add a name, if you have one. It belongs here, Part 4. While the first wave was still fighting through the searchlights, a second wave was already on its way in. Leading it was Lieutenant Commander John Hale, the commanding officer of 819 Squadron. His wave came in over the outer harbour and went for the Littorio and the Duilio. More torpedoes ran in the shallow water that was not supposed to allow them. The Littorio took 2 further hits. The Duilio took 1, low on the hull, and began to flood. By the time the last Swordfish turned for home, 3 battleships were sinking or settling at their moorings, and the last of the aircraft came back aboard the Illustrious before dawn. Not everyone came home. 1 aircraft of the second wave was hit and went down. Its crew, Lieutenant Gerald Bailey and Lieutenant Herbert Slaughter, were lost, and they were the only men of the raid who did not return. 2 others, Williamson and Scarlett, were prisoners. That was the whole cost to the attacking force. 2 men lost, 2 men taken, against half a battle fleet. The Italian commanders, when the shock passed, understood at once what had happened to them, and it is only fair to be clear about how much they had got right. They were right that their ships were powerful. They were right that their sailors were brave, and they were. They were right that the harbour was heavily defended, and it was. What they were wrong about was one single, buried assumption. The water was too shallow for a torpedo to run. Everything else in the disaster followed from that one quiet error. Their response was the response of professionals who had grasped the new reality in an afternoon. Within days, the surviving heavy ships were ordered north, away from Taranto, up to Naples, out of easy reach of the British carriers. The fleet that had been built to threaten the entire Mediterranean by its mere presence had been driven from its own principal base without a single ship of the line firing at another. The cost aboard the ships was real, and it should be spoken plainly, and only once. By the Italian record, the raid cost the fleet in the region of 59 men killed and several hundred wounded. These were professional sailors, doing their duty inside a defence that had been made obsolete over their heads in the course of one night. They deserved to be counted as men, and not as a line in someone else's triumph. And the wider world understood the size of it almost immediately. 2 days later, Winston Churchill rose in the House of Commons with what he called good news. He told the House that the Royal Navy had struck a crippling blow at the Italian fleet, that only 3 Italian battleships now remained effective, and that the result affected decisively the balance of naval power in the Mediterranean. That is the record. Not propaganda cooked up years afterwards, but a statement to Parliament 2 days after the event. Part 5. So, why couldn't the Italian fleet believe that old biplanes had wrecked them in their own harbour? Because to believe it, they first had to accept that the thing every navy on Earth knew for certain was simply wrong. Let me put the verdict in the plainest terms I can find. The Italians had the better ships, the British had the better idea. The Italian measure of power was the battleship, the big gun, the tonnage riding at anchor. The British measure of power that night was a torpedo that could run where a torpedo was not supposed to run, dropped from an aeroplane too old to be taken seriously, flown by men trained in a skill that nobody else had bothered to master. Afterwards, Admiral Cunningham set his own verdict down in the official record. As an example of economy of force, he wrote, it was probably unsurpassed. He said the night had shown, once and for all, that in the Fleet Air Arm the Navy held its most devastating weapon. Coming from a hard old sailor of the big gun school, that was no small confession, and we should be honest about the limits of it, because honesty is the only thing that gives reverence any weight. Taranto did not win the war in the Mediterranean. The Italian fleet was hurt, not destroyed. 2 of the 3 battleships were eventually raised and repaired. Hard years of convoy battles still lay ahead, and the Italian Navy fought many of them well. This was one night, not a conclusion, and the British had their share of fortune too. A storm days earlier had stripped away most of the harbour's barrage balloons. Many of the bombs that struck home never went off. It could have gone far worse for them than it did. But it happened. 21 aircraft, and it happened. I owe you one confession before the end. The officer on the breakwater at the start of this story, Vittorio Padovani, is not a documented man. He is a composite, a stand-in for the real Italian officers whose careful, correct and useless calculations that night are a matter of record. I invented him to give you a single face for their reasoning, but everything he believed, real men believed, and they believed it for good reasons. The others were entirely real. Kenneth Williamson and Norman Scarlett, dragged from the harbour and marched into years of captivity. John Hale, leading his wave through the fire over the outer anchorage. Gerald Bailey and Herbert Slaughter, who flew into that harbour and did not fly out of it. Remember the names. Remembering them is the only real reason to tell the story at all. Subscribe if you would like the next chapter, because there are more of these. More fleets, more impossible nights, more men whose names should not be allowed to quietly disappear. There is always another story somewhere in these years, where somebody trusted the old arithmetic, and somebody else did new arithmetic in the dark, and the world changed shape while the guns were still firing at the wrong height.